Hello and welcome to Coast AM's official YouTube channel. I'm your host, George Norrie. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel. And you can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and of course, on coasttocoastam.com. Well, welcome back to Coast to Coast. Everybody seems to be talking about climate change. They sure are in Paris, in Europe, and Scott Yarbrough with us, his book, The New Ice Age. Scott's early career, and this is interesting, was spent as a stock and commodity broker, and during this time, well, he spent a lot of time trying to understand some of the questions like why do things work the way they do, like we all think about, and what made prices in the investment markets go up and down. And what he learned was that everything ran in cycles. Using this knowledge, he turned to entrepreneurship and then founded a nightly commodity and stock market website. It's called markethighsandlows.com, which analyzed and reported on likely future directions of the markets. And seeing the price of natural gas, for example, falling to near record lows caused him to research the likely trend of weather and how it was likely to affect natural gas in the future. And what he found, well, it shocked him. So he wrote a book called The New Ice Age. Scott, this is interesting, coming from a non-climatologist or meteorologist. So welcome to the program.
Well, it's good to be here, George.
So how does a climatologist and meteorologist, a non-meteorologist, write a book on the new ice age?
Well, I do have some meteorological training. I've been a pilot for about 40 years, and so part of pilot training is studying meteorology. But this is a bigger picture than just your local weather.
Yeah,
this is obviously longer term things.
Give me your reaction to the world leaders meeting in Paris over climate change.
It's a lot of this started back in 1997 at the Kyoto Protocol, and everybody got together all with the false assumption that they needed to stop CO2 emissions. And last year in Lima, Peru, Canada backed right out of it. They said we're just not even going to be involved with this anymore. And they also made a statement. The United States, China, and India, three of the biggest polluters that we have, all said that they would not ratify any contract that would legally bind them to be responsible for paying for emissions.
So many people are arguing this subject matter. You just heard Dr. Tim Ball during my news segment, Scott, when you're on
Yeah,
hold.
He's right on the money.
And there are a lot of people seem to be tipping that way, but the world leaders don't. I find that baffling. What's going on?
Well, I don't know if it's because they've been given bad science, or they just don't know, or they've committed to this long enough back in the past that they kind of have to save face, and we're all on the same team kind of philosophy. The bottom line is that, as Tim was saying earlier, is that there's a large percentage there's over 31,000 scientists, 9,000 of which are PhDs, have signed something called the petitionproject.org, stating that all this science that they're talking about is wrong. I'm a very, very large group of scientists that say this is all nonsense.
I've always been convinced, Scott, that we're in an Earth cycle, like I think you are, and that these things are going to happen. They have happened. They will happen. They'll continue to happen.
It's been going on for a long time, and it will continue to go on for a long time. Everything in the solar system, George, is cyclical.
Yep, sure is. Now, tell me about the new ice age. Tell me about the book.
Well, the book, as you stated earlier, was just kind of something that I was looking in a different direction for, and kind of after doing serious internet research and reading everything I could get my hands on, I came across some things that made a lot of sense to me. First of all, they're cyclical in nature. They are based on a couple of different methodologies. One is called total solar irradiance, which is actually some of the Russian scientists hang their hat on this methodology, and it basically has to do with they give the Earth a yearly budget in terms of heating and cooling, and so this has to balance out, and they make their forecast based on that. I looked at a number of other different things. There are people that look at like ocean models, ocean temperature models, but there's a very short-term history in terms of how long those have been around. What I did find is that sunspots, which have been recorded since about the 1400s, have a very long history, and there have been a group of scientists that took those, plotted them all out, charted them all out, and they have built some very, very interesting models that for the last 10 or 15, 20 years have been pretty darned accurate.
Now, is it a dearth of sunspots that create cold, or is it a plentiful sunspot that creates...
It's the lack of sunspots that create cold. The sun is... Our Earth is... And again, a lot of this information is not known for sure, but a lot of people think that our solar system is very magnetic, very electric, and the sun is magnetic. And what happens is when there's high magnetic activity, there are more sunspots. That's an indication that the sun is warmer.
Uh-huh.
And then when they go through these cycles, and there are about 7 or 8 of these cycles, and they're of differing lengths. But when the sun cools, there are less sunspots because there's less magnetic activity. That also creates there's another group of scientists that study cosmic rays, and cosmic rays come from every different corner of our solar system and the universe, and they're just particles that have come from exploded stars and whatever else you can think of. They're just zipping everywhere. And what happens is when the sun cools, the protection that normally the sun would give us when there was a lot of sunspots and when it's really hot, it tends to not be as protective. So as the sun cools, more and more of these cosmic rays are allowed to filter into Earth, and what happens is they create lower clouds, and those lower clouds kind of radiate the sun back away, and that helps cool the Earth as well. So it's a combination of a couple of different things. But you and I both know that if the sun were to go out tomorrow, this planet would not last very long, or at least the people that live here and everything that lives here wouldn't be very long for this world.
Not at all. So Thanksgiving, of course, we cooked a turkey, Scott, and the oven was 325 degrees, and it stayed at 325 degrees. Now, whenever you open the oven door, of course, the temperature would go down. It would have to build itself back up again. And as I was looking at this oven and what it was doing to keep that temperature constant, I thought of the sun. And I just said, it doesn't take much for the sun to go out of kilter, and we're headed for one heck of a problem on this planet. Just a little bit.
Well, if we could film the sun from a distance, if we could go back and film it for a couple of thousand years and then play it back in slow motion, you'd see that it would be like a light bulb that would get, brighter and dimmer and brighter and dimmer. There's a lot of speculation as to what causes this. Some people think that it's possibly the large planets as they move around through our solar system. There's still a lot of unanswered questions about what holds everything together out there, dark matter and light matter and gravity and anti-gravity. So it's not, nobody has all the explanations for it, but the bottom line is that these cycles have worked in the past, and we're getting ready to head into something that's a little over 200 years old. One of the cycle that's about 205 years, and which was back during what's called the Dalton Minimum, which ran roughly from about 1790 to about 1820. They last 30 to 40 years. This is not, when you say ice age, we're not talking about 3,000 feet of snow, up over the top of North America.
Right, not this time.
It's going to last for 1,000 years. This is just going to be a major cooling period. Won't last that long, but it's going to be terrifically and frigidly cold for a lot longer than a lot of people, at least during the wintertime, than people are ready for.
We have a guest named Robert Felix who wrote a book called Not by Fire, But by Ice, and he claims we're in the early stages of a mini ice age as well, Scott.
Well, I can't disagree with him. I'm not familiar with his book, but I've only done my own research, and it came from a number of different people, some of them from NASA. And so I have to agree. I think we're heading for a lot colder weather than people are ready for. That's, to tell you the truth, George, that's why I wrote the book. After I found this stuff out, I realized that people need to prepare. There are things that have to be done. in order for people to get through this more comfortably. And there are serious potential dangers that can come from this.
Next week, I've got former ABC newsman Ted Koppel on, and Ted has written a book now on trying to preserve the power grid, something, Scott, I've been talking about for a couple of years now, where, one, an EMP attack, of course, from some nation that detonates a nuke in the atmosphere would shut down our power grid. But also, more importantly, is, we could have another Carrington-style X-flare from the sun, which would shut down our power grid. And can you imagine, coupled with what you're talking about, and that's frigid temperatures, the power goes out and people don't have heat? What a disaster. You're talking about biblical proportions.
Well, there's a couple of things that could happen along with an EMP, which I think probably as the sun cools, the likelihood of a solar event to have that happen is less likely. A nuclear event, who knows?
Who knows? Exactly.
There is another wild card, though.
What's that?
And that is volcanic activity.
Yeah.
In 1815, during the Dalton Minimum, that was pretty much near the end of the Dalton Minimum, Mount Tambora in Indonesia had a monstrously huge explosion, and it just filled the atmosphere full of sulfur dioxide.
Hold on, Scott. Let's talk more about these volcanoes and your work. A great job, by the way, the new ice age. We'll be back in a moment. I'm George Noory. This is Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. George Noory with you. Scott Yarbrough with us, his book, The New Ice Age. Scott, we were talking about volcanoes. You're absolutely correct. Those are planet killers.
Well, if you go back and you look what happened, just to go back in just a second, during the Dalton Minimum, in 1815, Mount Tambora in Indonesia had a monstrous explosion. It filled the atmosphere full of sulfur dioxide, and the following year was called the year without a summer. And in New England, it snowed in June and July. They had frost about every other day for the better part of the summer. They could not get seeds to germinate and plants to grow, and a lot of people starved around the world. And for those that don't get prepared for what's coming, that potential exists again. Now, that's a wild card. No, it's difficult to predict when volcanoes are going to go off, although we have a pretty active ring of fire right now. There's a website called Volcano Discovery that keeps up abreast of all that activity on volcanoes, and it's a good thing. I watch it quite a bit. But these are one of these wild cards that if something like that happens, it could be really, really disastrous. As it is, we're going to have some very, very frigid temperatures, and these temperatures alone could lead to serious crop failures. If you look at anything roughly above about the 40th latitude, which includes Russia and Canada, they are the fifth and sixth largest producers of wheat in the world. Russia happens to be the third largest consumer of wheat. So if they were to lose 60, 70, 80% of their wheat crops, it wouldn't be a very pretty picture. You could have food shortages, you could have social chaos, which is a kind way of saying anarchy. But these are difficult things to forecast. My whole look at this, George, was based on the science. And I kind of promote. Listen, you look at the book, you look at the science, and make up your own mind. You have a very intelligent audience, the people that think for themselves, and so that's kind of how I look at this. Look at the science, make up your own mind. I think the conclusions are pretty cut and dried.
And Scott, when you talk about frigid temperatures, what kind of temperatures are we talking about?
Well, I wouldn't be surprised to see 50 below zero weeks at a time. Last year in Michigan, we had 20 below temperatures in November. We've been lucky so far this fall.
Oh, my God.
And not only will they get down to close to those levels, but the temperatures are going to go further south. It's going to be colder further south than it has been in a couple of hundred years, and people don't know. I mean, since we've had electricity, we haven't had to, nobody's gone through these kind of temperatures. The Indians in Florida called it white rain from when it was snowing the last time we went through that, but there's not a lot of history about it, and people aren't aware of it. They will be not too far down the road, and so preparation's pretty important to get ready for this.
And when these things occur, are we having extremes on both ends, Scott, and that is extreme hot and extreme cold? Does it go like that?
Weather. When you learn about weather, one of the first things you learn is that weather is the result of the uneven heating of the earth. That's what weather is. And so, yeah, you do. You get what happens is like the jet stream for the last, until just recently, for the last couple of weeks has been kind of wrapped around the Rocky Mountains, and it's just been cold as can be over, inside that northern jet stream there. But these things move and they change. And, yes, you can have periods where you have one place is being flooded. Well, it's like last year. Last year, the center of the country and the eastern part of the country was as cold as it could be, but yet on the west coast, it was warm. So you get these kind of differences all the time. That's just the nature of weather.
Just in the weather episode over the past several days, we've got 14 people dead in the Midwest and plains. I mean, and we're talking about just a lot of rain and water and, just lousy weather. Can you imagine how bad things would be if we get into those temperatures you just talked about?
Yeah, I can imagine exactly how bad it could be. And again, that's what this is all about, is preparation. People need to do the right things to get ready for this when it happens. Forewarned is forearmed. And one of the things that can happen is I think you're going to see some pretty big snowstorms happen. When we get a kind of a combination of a big moisture event. Look what happened at the end of October when they had that hurricane that came through Mexico, and then the remnants went up through Texas and just flooded everything out. Imagine when you get a big moisture event like that, and then you've got 30-degree or 40-degree below zero temperatures, and that could run all the way down into southern Missouri or Kansas or Arkansas, into Alabama, Georgia, and then what happens? 3 feet, 4 feet, maybe 5 feet of snow could happen within a matter of a couple of days. There's a lot of people further south. These are the people that have the biggest risk. It's because they're not used to this. The people up in Canada that are used to the cold are probably the best suited to live through it, and they're already know what they need to know and are dressed for what they need to dress, and their homes are set up for that. So I think you're going to see a lot of that. Not a lot, but there are going to be some major storms happen.
Should we all buy a couple Siberian Huskies and a sled?
Well, I think a snowmobile is more fun, but I guess that depends on your preference.
I guess. Let's talk about some of the tips for what we can do. Based on, let's say, first of all, assuming the power grid doesn't go down and we still have power with these frigid temperatures or big snowstorms, what are some of the pointers here?
Well, there's a number of things that can be done. One of the things is to do an assessment of your home. And in my book, there's a couple of chapters on what you need to do to prepare. There's a lot of individual tips, obviously more than we're going to be able to cover tonight. But you need to make sure that your house is going to be as warm as it possibly can be. And there's some tricks you can do. Like one of the tricks is that if you have a basement in your home, to put insulation over the basement windows. Mm-hmm. It's a small, minor thing, but it all adds up. If you live anywhere probably north of the Gulf of Mexico, and you have a well and septic tank, and that's how you get your water, and that's how your sanitary system works in your house.
Right, some pumps.
What's going to happen at 20 below zero to your wellhead if you don't have electric tape on it?
It'll freeze on you. That's right.
Yeah, and then where are you at? Then you don't have water, right? That's not good. Or you can't use your toilet or your shower. You don't have any water draining.
With septic tanks, which are not part of your sewer system, but if a septic tank, which a lot of farms have, where your waste goes from your house, would those freeze up? Generally not, I don't think.
It depends. There's a lot of places that further south where people have never had to deal with really cold weather. So pipes are buried not very far down into the ground in some cases. Sometimes they're even outside on dwellings. And then they go down into the ground because people haven't had to deal with it. This is pretty much new for what I call modern man, and by modern man I mean since the dawn of electricity. But there's these are the little things like this that need to be done. You need to have some emergency plans for around your house as to how you're going to, if there are problems. Part of the problem is that you're going to get storms further south where municipalities are not used to dealing with it. Where like today we had the storm that you just mentioned. There was freezing rain that knocked a bunch of power lines down.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Now, what happens if you are in an area where they're not used to dealing with that? Maybe it takes 4 or 5 days before you get your power back,
or a few weeks, yeah.
Yeah, or a few weeks. So how are you going to deal with that?
One thing that concerns me too, Scott, is the weight of snow on roofs. At what point will they just collapse?
Well, that depends. See, if you go back and you bring up a really good point there, George, because depending on where you live, there are different codes on how you have to build homes. And generally, the further north you go, the higher pitch you have on a roof. And that's for a reason. That's so the snow will fall off. How far is that down in the south? That's a good question. They don't have anywhere near the pitch requirements that they do in the north. That's a really good point. You could have roofs stressed easily to the point where they collapse if you get a big enough snow farther south.
You talk about megatrends that collide. Tell me about these trends.
Well, there's 3 or 4 of them that are going on right now. One of them is the demographics. You have 10,000 people retiring every day.
Yeah.
Between now and 2030, half the population will be over 65. So here we are going into a time frame which probably from an economic standpoint doesn't look tremendously rosy when you add everything up. These winters have been horrible in terms of the GDP. It's a big drag on GDP. So you got a lot of people retiring. You have an economy that's going to be whacked by wintertime. In the book, there's a chart from that was put together by the United Nations, and it has to do with when there's a window of opportunity for a nation, and it's all basically based on the demographics of a country. Our window is closed. The United Kingdom's window is closed. Russia's window is closed. The 3 main countries where there is now big growth opportunity are, guess, India, China, Brazil.
Yeah.
And so you have a number of these things all coming together at the same time. None of it is very rosy looking for the economy.
Now, one of the things, too, Scott, that I don't want people to confuse pollution with wanting to better the environment. Nobody wants this planet polluted. I don't. You don't. I am sure automobiles and factories contribute to emissions and some kind of greenhouse gases, but I don't believe it's having an abundant effect on the climate. So we should be doing 2 things. One, I would prefer if these global leaders meeting in Paris didn't talk about climate change, but talked about pollution of the planet and how we could fix that up. Islands, for example, of plastic floating in the ocean that has all accumulated together. That's a different issue, and I think we should fix that. But they don't seem to be talking about that.
You're 100% correct. They'd be doing everybody a favor if they would just talk about clean water and, like you said, pollution. I spent last winter in Puerto Rico, and I walk the beach every day for exercise. And they take the the barge is out, I don't know how many miles, 4 or 5, 10 miles, and they dump all the garbage from the island out in the ocean. It all washes back up on the beach.
It sure does.
It's pretty nasty. And I agree with you 100% that if this effort was put into just keeping things cleaner and making recycling, let's say, mandatory in every place, that would be a better service to the people that inhabit this planet than talking about CO2 gases that most scientists are just laugh at it. It's, the oceans, George, transfer more carbon dioxide every year than we've probably ever made on the planet. It gets processed. Higher CO2 amounts are actually good for the planet. We're about medium right now compared to where we've been in terms of higher CO2. So it's like the doctor said earlier. It's probably money based. My book is not based on politics. I try to stay clear of politics. I'm just looking at the science of why do we get climate change. It's that big yellow ball in the sky out there. That's what determines whether we get hot or cold.
You talk about several things that people can do investment-wise to profit during this kind of a situation. What would that be?
Well, there's a couple of different things, and I think there's 5 or 6 different things in the book, but just to throw a couple out here right now, I still think natural gas is in the process of putting in a low here, and that there's and again, be sure to check with your investment advisor because this is just for educational purposes and is not to be construed as investment advice. But UNG, Uniform November Gulf, is a natural gas play. That's an ETF, and it won't be long. We're heading into this cold period now. It's going to be with us for quite a while, and even though we have the sun technically peaked in about 1990 in terms of its heat, and it's been dropping ever since. It takes a while for the temperatures to catch up, and then once the Earth gets a little bit colder, and then it starts to move a little bit. It moves a little bit faster in the trend than it's going, and it tends to stay like that. The waters tend to stay colder. I think you'll see in the next 10 years that Lake Superior could remain frozen year-round.
Wow, that's unbelievable.
That's a little bit down the road. So look at what the potential will be in various things in terms of if we have shortages in crops, and if it's going to get colder, it's pretty much a certainty we're going to have a shorter growing season. Winters are going to be another month longer or a month and a half longer on the front and the back ends. So that's a shorter growing season. Crops are going to be in greater demand. They're going to be probably less food. So look at the things. Here's another thing. How about car batteries?
Oh, yes.
Car batteries are going to be worn out. People that make car batteries are going to do very well. Propane delivery companies are going to do very well. There's a number of different things. Again, supermarkets will always do well. Well, the problem with supermarkets is it's so competitive. There's not a lot of great margins in food.
Margins are small, and people can't set up a business like that anyway.
Yeah, and it's not going to do well if you've got a huge snowstorm and you can't get to the supermarket.
That's right. I mean, we've got a lot of clients that deal with preparedness. One is My Patriot Supply. They deal with storable food for the future, Scott, and I think they're right on. They've touched an idea in a market that is necessary based on everything you and I know.
Well, in the book, I say, hey, we owe them a debt of gratitude because they've put together a system. There are ways and means now to get these things, and I think that they've not known for years, I think, why they've done what they've done, but I think what's coming is going to be a part of what they've been preparing for.
I think so. A couple of minutes here, Scott, before the break, and then we're going to come back and take phone calls with you as well. When you talk to people about your work, the New Ice Age, Generally, what do they say about it?
Well, if you're talking about what, the scientific community?
Scientific first, people in general?
Well, most people that you talk to are still under the assumption that we're going into global warming, because that's what's been talked about the most. So, and people just parrot what they hear. I had a book review from a guy. He says, it is very well written and accessible to people with little background in science or engineering. Many professional scientists agree with you that solar influences on climate have been greatly underestimated. I like the way you have educated yourself on many aspects of climate physics. You have asked all the right questions and in many cases provided solid answers.
Perfect. We're going to come back, talk more about this with Scott Yarbrough, his book, The New Ice Age, and your calls next on Coast to Coast AM. Thank you for listening to Coast AM on our official YouTube channel. I'm your host, George Norrie, and don't forget to visit the Coast Insider membership area on coasttocoastam.com, where you can access our past, upcoming, and classic shows.